for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Birds of Prey and the Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn, or as it would later be rebranded, Harley Quinn Birds of Prey, which I'll talk about later, is the overall 8th installment of the DC Extended Universe to be directed by Cathy Yan, who was only known for directing one other movie before this called Dead Pigs, which not much is really known about it other than that it was well liked by critics, but not so much by the movie-going audience. And as far as production detail of the movie is concerned, there's not really much to talk about with this movie other than its box office, because oh man, this movie did not perform well at the box office, to the point that not only is it, as of this moment, the lowest grossing movie set within the DC Extended Universe, but also the lowest grossing movie to be based on any DC property in general. Now, to put that in perspective, the 2010 DC movie Jonah Hex made more money its opening weekend than Birds of Prey did. And on top of that, the week after, you get the release of the live-action Sonic movie, which became the highest grossing movie of that February, making it, I think, the only time a video game-based movie outperformed a comic book movie, both critically and financially speaking. Just let that sink in for a little bit. Alright, enough with that nonsense. Onward with the actual review itself. Is Birds of Prey and the Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn any good? As for the plot of the movie, sometime after the events of Suicide Squad, Harley Quinn, who just got dumped by the Joker, is put into direct conflict with a narcissistic gangster known as Black Mask, who recently just put a hit out on a little girl for stealing one of his diamonds. And now it's up to Harley Quinn, along with several other women consisting of a detective and two vigilantes known as the Huntress and Black Canary, to set aside their differences and join forces to not only protect the young girl, but to also put an end to Black Mask's crime syndicate. In terms of what I liked about the movie, I really love the way this movie began by having this 2 to 3 minute animated segment detailing Harley Quinn's backstory within this continuity of movies set within the DC Extended Universe for a couple reasons. One reason being, it does a really nice job explaining how Harley Quinn became Harley Quinn in a short amount of time. But the thing that really surprised me the most is the fact that the movie began as an animated segment, and I wasn't expecting that kind of animation to appear in a movie like this. So I was pleasantly surprised by the way this movie began. I also think that the movie moves at a good pace where it's not too fast, but moves at just the right speed for the movie to tell its story. Since the movie clearly takes a lot of inspiration from Quentin Tarantino's filmmaking, which I'll talk about later, another aspect of the movie that I enjoyed are the action scenes themselves. I found some of them to be refreshing because, unlike your typical action sequence within a superhero movie that are mostly CGI heavy, the action scenes that occur in this movie involve a lot more stunt work, which is refreshing, since you get to actually see a group of people in front of the camera perform their own stunts, as opposed to relying on a lot of CGI to do the work. Sure, the fight choreography itself isn't the best, but it gets the job done. And on top of that, some of the action scenes are pretty fun to watch, especially the climax where you have Harley Quinn on rollerblades being pushed by Black Canary's Cry in order to pursue Black Mask in a car. That I thought was a really fun chase scene. Granted, I actually found most of the set pieces that occur during the climax where you have Harley Quinn, the Birds of Prey, battling Black Mask's legion of false facers within the confines of the abandoned amusement park to be really fun. Then again, the fight choreography in this movie was done by the same guys that worked on the fight choreography in the John Wick movies, so that might explain a few things. Although the one aspect of the movie that really surprised me the most is that the movie harkens back to the 2016 Suicide Squad movie in one particular way, which is having very similar visual aesthetics, in that sense where the movie has a dark and gritty tone, but includes a lot of bright colors throughout the entire movie. Everything from visual effects to costume designs, which I'll talk about way later. But the movie isn't trying to be a copy of Suicide Squad. Instead, it does its own thing with the gritty tone and the bright, colorful aesthetics, giving Birds of Prey its own visual flair that's similar but different from the 2016 Suicide Squad movie. I also thought that the movie had some really good cinematography, in the sense that most of the shots seen throughout the movie, regardless if it's Harley Quinn walking away from the exploding chemical plant to some of the action scenes, regardless if it's the shootout occurs at the police station or the climax, since most of these shots are framed in a way where you can see what's clearly going on in front of the screen without there being any shaky camera angles. And on top of that, I think this is the one time I could think of in which a movie did some good slow-mo shots, because I think the last few times I've seen an action movie use some slow-mo shots was in the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, which I thought was very unnecessary. But in this movie, when you do see it occur, I thought it was done very well. And you get to see the way the cinematography really complements the visual aesthetics of the movie itself. Now, in regards to the aspects of the movie that I had mixed feelings towards, starting with the main villain of Ronan Sionis, aka Black Mask, because I have mixed feelings about him. Most negative, but mixed nonetheless. Because on the one hand, I think the actor Ian McGregor does a good job of playing the character, and looked like he was having a lot of fun chewing scenery left and right throughout the entire movie. And when you first get introduced to the character, yeah, he was pretty much a cartoony villain, which I thought was entertaining. But as the movie progressed, he slowly just got on my nerves, and at first glance, I couldn't figure out as to why he got on my nerves. But the more I thought about it, it came down to one of three factors. The first factor being how different this version of Black Mask is in comparison to his comic book counterpart. Because the character of Black Mask, no matter if it's the version of the character that appears in the comic books or some of the various animated TV shows or movies, is often depicted as a typical mob boss who can be sadistic and short-tempered. Whereas the movie counterpart, while still being a crime boss, he's very narcissistic and flamboyant. Reason number two, the character almost felt a bit too familiar, because as I sat there watching the movie, I am definitely well aware that this is indeed the character's first appearance in a theatrical movie, but something about his mannerisms and body language and acting just felt a bit too familiar to me. And again, like I said a few moments ago, I couldn't put my finger on it at first. But the more I thought about it, it occurred to me that Black Mask has a lot in common with the Joker that we see in Suicide Squad, to a point that I'm convinced at some point that version of the Joker was meant to be the main villain of this movie. At least that's the impression I get. Reason number three, the character in and of itself is not that threatening, to a point that the movie itself actually points this out at the very end of the movie. There's never a point in time where I felt scared of this villain. The closest we ever get to this character being scary is a point in time where he gets pissed off at some random chick and has her dance at a table. For a very petty reason, outside of that one scene, he's really not that threatening. I actually find Lex Luthor Jr. from Batman vs. Superman to be more threatening than Black Mask in this movie. Another aspect of the movie that I had mixed feelings about is the filmmaking style. For the simple reason that it feels very reminiscent to that of Quentin Tarantino's movie Pulp Fiction, where the movie is told both in and out of order. And that's really refreshing to see in a superhero movie like this. But my biggest gripe with it has to do with how the movie handles certain segments in terms of how we go from one scene to another. The scene in question that I'm thinking about begins with Harley Quinn walking right into the police station and shooting up the joint. We don't know why she's even at the police joint in the first place. And before we get too far within this action sequence, Harley Quinn breaks the fourth wall state. Alright, if you're wondering why I'm doing this, let's go back 2 days ago. And then the movie cuts to 2 days ago, showcasing all the events leading up to her shooting up the police joint. Now, granted, the information presented is important, but I thought it went on a little bit too long to a point that I completely even forgot as to why we're having this flashback in the first place until we fast forward to the current moment in which Harley Quinn is shooting up the police station. Now, granted, this doesn't happen often, but it does happen a few times throughout the movie. And before I go any further, you're probably confused as to what I mean by the movie is told both in and out of order like Pulp Fiction. Essentially, the story is obviously told out of order, but when you look at the movie as a whole, it's told in order, where in the first third, you're introduced to your characters and introduced to your conflict. And of course, in your second act, you have the rising conflict and seeing how the characters progressed from Act 1. And then you have Act 3, which is the resolution of said conflict and seeing where the characters end up by then. Similar to Pulp Fiction. Granted, the filmmaking style itself isn't quite in the same ballpark as Quentin Tarantino's filmmaking, but you can definitely tell the filmmakers behind this movie took a lot of inspiration from Tarantino style filmmaking without being a complete ripoff. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, let's start with the movie's title, because the movie is called Birds of Prey in the Fabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Yet when you watch the movie, it's not about the birds of prey, it's more about Harley Quinn. So really, the movie should have been called Harley Quinn and the Birds of Prey. Or I think it is in some other parts of the world, because the actual Birds of Prey portion of the movie doesn't really kick in until the ending epilogue as told by Harley Quinn after the big battle at the amusement park, in the form of that of a throwaway line of dialogue, which leads into another problem that I have with the movie. Because when Suicide Squad came out back in 2016, the producers over at Warner Brothers announced that they were going to make more movies based on various DC superheroes, and one of them was going to be a solo Harley Quinn movie, along with several other characters like Aquaman and Shazam. But as time progressed, it felt like we gone back to Batman vs. Superman territory, where when it came to the creation of this movie, it felt like there were two different groups of people. You either had the one group of people that wanted to make a Harley Quinn movie, or you had the other group of people who wanted to make a Birds of Prey movie, and decided, hey, why not we combine both together, resulting in this movie. And here's the thing, Birds of Prey and the Fabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn could have been two separate movies, with one movie being Gotham Sirens, being more Harley Quinn focused, in which she teams up with Catwoman and Poison Ivy in order to protect a girl named Helena Bertinelli from Black Mask, which could have resulted in the second movie being that Birds of Prey spinoff, predominantly focusing on Helena Bertinelli becoming Huntress, forming the Birds of Prey team consisting of her, Black Canary, and really any other female superhero ranging from the likes of Lady Blackhawk, Dove, Misfit, or even bring back Kitana from Suicide Squad and have them fight against someone like Lady Shiva, which could have resulted in two very cool movies, but instead the producers decided to make a Birds of Prey movie that's more about Harley Quinn than the actual Birds of Prey. Oh, and speaking of Helena Bertinelli, aka the Huntress, talk about a wasted character, because when you look at the advertising to this movie, the actress who plays Huntress is second bill behind Margot Robbie, and you think she would play a bigger role in the entire movie, considering the fact that the diamond Black Mask is after technically belongs to her. She barely appears in the movie, to a point that I literally forgot she was even in the movie. Seriously, the character herself makes her first appearance within the first 15 minutes of the movie and doesn't reappear again until the start of the third act of the movie. And as I mentioned before, when the Huntress reappears at the start of the third act, I completely forgot she was even in the movie. Another problem that I have with the movie are the costume designs, because even though I think the costumes are well made, I'm the kind of guy that looks for how accurate is the costume to the comic book counterpart, and all of the costumes that the characters wear look nothing like their comic book counterparts. And the reason as to why this bugs me so much, we live in a post-Avengers world, and we're at that point where a lot of the designs that the characters have in the comics, with some modifications, can work on the big screen. Case in point, the overall costume that Black Manta wears in Aquaman, that was the one costume that I would never think would translate well from the comics to a movie. Yet, the filmmakers found a way to translate that costume from the comics to a live-action medium, and made it work really well within the context of that movie. Yet, when it came to the costume design in this movie, it felt like the filmmakers tried to reinvent the wheel in terms of how certain characters should look. Starting with the Huntress, because I feel like of the characters that actually wear costumes in this movie, she's the one that I have the least amount of problems with, because at least with Huntress, in regards to her comic book counterpart, much like any other character, she's gone through quite a bit of costume design over the years, predominantly wearing a black jumpsuit with some white and purple highlights. With the costume that Huntress wears in this movie, it looks like an amalgamation of the costume she wore during the early 2000s, along with the costume she wears during the DC Rebirth comic line. And on pen and paper, that sounds like a cool idea, but when you see the costume in the movie, she looks less like Huntress and more like a knockoff member of the Blood Pack from Blade 2. And despite that, at least I kind of get the impression this is Huntress, thanks to the purple highlights she has on her costume. And sadly, she's the one that fares the best in regards to costume design, because the costumes that Black Canary and Harley Quinn wear throughout the entire movie, oh boy, do I have problems with them. Now, much like the Huntress, the costume design for both Black Canary and Harley Quinn has changed over the years, but at least there was a consistency with their costumes. With someone like Black Canary, she usually wore some kind of leggings with like a corset top and a jacket of some sort. With the costume she wears in the movie, it's just regular civilian clothing. I mean, she does wear a black jumpsuit at the end of the movie, but I kind of wish she wore that throughout the entire thing, because as it is, she just wore like black pants with a yellow tank top type shirt, and that just really bugged me. And then you have Harley Quinn, and oh boy, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the slutty cheerleader costume that she wore in Suicide Squad that I hated very much looked a lot better than all the costumes she wore in this entire movie. Because at least with the costume she wore in Suicide Squad, at least I got the impression this was Harley Quinn. With all the costumes that she wears in this movie, she might as well have been her own character, and it also kind of defeats the purpose of her name, because her name is a play on words of Harlequin, which typically look like jesters, and I know that Harley Quinn in recent years has moved past the whole jester costume, but at least all the other costumes she wears take some sort of inspiration from it. And I know all of the costumes that Huntress, Black Canary, and Harley Quinn wear in the comics look ridiculous and wouldn't look realistic, but I'm not asking for realism here, I'm asking for a comic book. I mean, if Black Manta's costume could translate well from the comics to the Aquaman movie, I can't see why any of the costumes that Huntress, Black Canary, and Harley Quinn have worn in the comics can't work in the movie as well. Another problem I have with the movie revolves around two specific plot points that just don't make any sense to me. My first example of a plot point that didn't make any sense to me revolves around Roman Sionis wanting to obtain the Bertinelli diamond to become rich and powerful. And the reason as to why I think this particular plot point didn't make sense within the context of the movie, within the first third of the movie when we are introduced to Roman Sionis, it's already established that he is a rich and powerful mob boss. So what benefit does he really get from obtaining the diamond? He just becomes more rich and powerful, even though he was already rich and powerful to begin with? Something's just not adding up here. Now, it'd be one thing if the movie established that out of all of the gangs that exist within Gotham, maybe Roman Sionis is considered to be low on the totem pole out of any of the mob bosses that exist within Gotham. And maybe by obtaining the Bertinelli diamond, this will put him higher up on the food chain. Although, from what I could gather, whether or not this particular detail is true or not, apparently in the original draft of Birds of Prey, the Bertinelli diamond didn't contain codes or account numbers for the Bertinelli fortune, but apparently it contains nude pics of Roman Sionis preferring sausage over clams. And if that is the case, that actually does make sense within the context of the movie, given that we see he appears to have a more intimate relationship with his henchman Victor Zsasz, and does appear to be insecure anytime we see him hanging around any of the female characters within the movie. Another plot point that doesn't make any sense to me occurs near the end of the movie, sometime before the climax, in which we see Harley Quinn getting into a fist fight with Detective Montoya. Now, why this particular fight scene didn't make sense to me. In Suicide Squad, we see her, along with the Suicide Squad, taking on Eyes of the Adversary, which are the mutant minions of the Enchantress. And she was able to take on these particular foot soldiers no problem whatsoever, no matter if she was by herself on the elevator or with the Suicide Squad itself. In this movie, you have that huge action scene that occurs at the police station where she takes on a bunch of armed police officers and manages to beat them no problem, then takes on a whole squad of prisoners, again, has no problem dealing with them, and then proceeds to take on the thugs of Ronan Sionis while on cocaine and manages to take them all out. Yet, for some reason, when we see Harley Quinn fighting Detective Montoya, who is drunk by the way, Detective Montoya actually gives Harley Quinn a run for her money. Just let that sink in for a little bit. Harley Quinn had a hard time fighting a drunk female police detective, but had no problems battling squads of mutant foot soldiers, police officers, prisoners, or goons whatsoever. Now, it'd be one thing if someone like the Huntress decided to pick a fist fight with Harley Quinn sometime before the climax, then I could see Harley Quinn having a hard time, given that Huntress is a very skilled fighter. But with someone like Detective Montoya, who is drunk, not so much. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the depiction of the character of Cassandra Cain, because if I had to compare Cassandra Cain from the comics to the movie counterpart, these two might as well have been two completely different characters, because Cassandra Cain in the comics is the daughter of assassins David Cain and Lady Shiva, who is a martial arts expert but lacks social skills, the ability to talk and read due to the conditioning that her parents put her through when becoming an assassin, that was later adopted by Batman into becoming the third iteration of Batgirl after Barbara Gordon was paralyzed by the Joker, whose recurring story arc is trying to be a normal person while fighting crime, while Cassandra Cain in the movie is a overweight 12-year-old who lives with neglectful foster parents, has the ability to talk and socialize, is a pickpocket that often needs protection from people like Harley Quinn or any member of the Birds of Prey, who ends up being basically adopted by Harley Quinn by the end of the movie, making Cassandra Cain the DCEU equivalent to the MCU's depiction of the Mandarin from Iron Man 3. And on top of that, she, much like any other kid character in any other movie, is just an annoyance. Not just to the main cast of characters within the movie for constantly either protecting or trying to capture her, but also just a nuisance to the people watching the movie in general, like myself. And honestly, as the movie progressed, she just got on my nerves. I honestly would have rather have seen Harley Quinn hang out with the stuffed beaver she has in her apartment than this depiction of Cassandra Cain any day of the week. Another problem that I have with the movie is the humor, because I just didn't think it was all that funny to begin with. Outside of one joke, which takes on the form of the recurring joke of showing the name and the grievance of the people that Harley Quinn screwed over in some shape or form. And when we get to the main villain, we see his name pop up, followed by his grievance, which at first says broke driver's legs, and then it changes over to having a vagina, causing mischief, and it just kept going. And this to me was the funniest joke in the entire movie, because I felt that all the other jokes that occurred before and after that one particular joke just fell flat, and I just didn't think any of them were all that funny. Although, I think my biggest problem with the entire movie revolves around Harley Quinn herself and the movie surrounding her for a couple reasons. Reason number one, her costume design. And I'm not gonna talk about this aspect of her character again only because I talked about Harley Quinn's costuming earlier in this review, so I won't bring it up again. Although the more I thought about it, earlier in the movie we technically do see Harley Quinn in a red and black jumpsuit during the roller derby sequence, but outside of that, she doesn't really wear anything resembling her costume throughout the entire movie. Reason number two, Harley Quinn, within the context of this movie, tries way too hard to be Deadpool. And here's the thing, if I wanted to watch a superhero that constantly broke the fourth wall and poke fun at certain tropes seen within comic books or movies, I would just sit down and watch Deadpool and Deadpool 2. Harley Quinn should not be Deadpool. Seriously, on top of constantly breaking the fourth wall throughout the whole entire movie, there's one sequence in particular that had Deadpool written all over it, and it's near the beginning of the movie where we see Harley Quinn attempting to eat a egg sandwich, and something happens where she ends up dropping it by mistake and she gets upset over it. And this to me just said, oh, it's basically Deadpool with chimichangas, just replace Deadpool with Harley Quinn, chimichangas with egg sandwiches. And by having Harley Quinn be essentially a female Deadpool, I feel is kind of redundant because DC Comics has so many other characters that break the fourth wall already, ranging from the likes of Mr. Mixie-Plix, Batmite, Ambushbug, to Animal Man. Now, granted, with a character like Animal Man, he goes about it in a Lovecraftian angle, as opposed to the other three which go about it in a comical sense. But I feel that this movie really should have made Harley Quinn, and not a female Deadpool with bits of Harley Quinn's story. Granted, there's already a female Deadpool within the Marvel comics, but that's a whole nother can of worms altogether. Reason number three, wasted potential. Because the whole crux of Harley Quinn and Joker's relationship back when she first appeared in Batman the Animated Series was to showcase what an abusive relationship looks like. Now, since then, Harley Quinn has made the smart decision and decided she wanted nothing to do with the Joker. But when she spent time in a romantic relationship with the Joker, it was anything but happy, since the Joker has both psychologically and physically abused her on multiple occasions and manipulates her all the time. And this movie covers none of that, since the entire movie is focused more on the whole idea of I don't need no man idea, which isn't a bad idea if it was a part of her character arc at the end of the movie. As the movie sits, it does not cover the domestic abusive side of their relationship, and she goes through this character arc within the first 10 minutes of the movie after she blows up the chemical plant, and for the remainder of the movie goes through a flat arc, wasting both good source material to draw from and an R rating. Seriously, this movie could have taken inspiration from other movies like the 2002 movie Enough or the 1991 movie Sleeping with the Enemy, two movies that have women dealing with abusive relationships. And the thing is, I think that aspect of the character could have worked for this movie, where within the first act of the movie we get to see the abusive relationship between Joker and Harley. Then during the second act, after Joker breaks up with Harley, maybe throughout it we see Harley Quinn being hopelessly still in love with the Joker, but as the second act progresses, maybe she looks at various things, like in Suicide Squad, that have her reflecting on the relationship, showing the negative side, and then sometime either before the third act or at the end of the third act, she comes to the conclusion that she doesn't need him anymore. And while this is happening, you could take this depiction of Cassandra Cain and tie it in with Harley Quinn's story arc on an emotional level, where it turns out that Cassandra got abused by both her foster parents, which could give some explanation behind why Cassandra's left arm is bandaged up, since we're never really given an answer throughout the movie, thus allowing both Harley Quinn and Cassandra to connect with each other on an emotional level, because both of them have experience being in an abusive relationship, seeking comfort with one another, in some kind of weird way, of course. But as I mentioned before, we don't get any of that. So, for my final verdict of Birds of Prey in the Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn, if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, take the worst aspects of the 2011 movie Sucker Punch, Suicide Squad, Batman vs. Superman, Batman Forever, Deadpool, Deadpool 2, put those into a blender, and you get Birds of Prey. For the simple reason that the movie felt like a train wreck from start to finish. Admittedly, a fun train wreck, but a train wreck nonetheless. Because, as I said a few moments ago, Birds of Prey just felt like someone took a bunch of different movies and put them into a blender. And on top of that, out of all of the installments within the DC Extended Universe, in my opinion, I considered this to be the worst installment of the entire franchise so far. Which is a shame, because all of the installments between Wonder Woman and Shazam, it felt like this franchise was starting to get its footing and go in the right direction. But then, all of a sudden, with this installment, it felt like they took a huge step back. Going back to the dark days of the franchise when we still had installments from Man of Steel up to Suicide Squad. And to add on top of that, I felt that this movie was just a wasted opportunity altogether. So overall, Birds of Prey and the Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn is a fun train wreck. Just one I don't think I'll probably won't revisit again anytime soon. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Birds of Prey? So it looked like Birds of Prey got really good reception, surprisingly. And I find that hard to believe because I swear I must have seen a different movie or something. Well, whatever the case, I give Birds of Prey and the Fabulous Emancipation of one Harley Quinn a 2 out of 5. So, do you think this movie should have been a Gotham Sirens movie or a Birds of Prey movie in which Harley Quinn is the main villain? And see you later.